Today, we're talking about how the Biden administration is likely to proceed on global trade, what will change and what won't. And as our guest Ling Wei of the Wall Street Journal pointed out, there's still 10 weeks of the Trump administration to go. So we'll talk about what might happen in the meanwhile as well. I'm so delighted to welcome our distinguished guests. First up will be Mary Lovely, Professor of Economics at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and a Senior Fellow of the Peterson Institute of International Economics. Mary spoke to us in June with Ling's co-author, Bob Davis of the Wall Street Journal. And her talk was a hit with journalists. So we've asked her to come back and give you not just an overview, but some trade data that's nicely curated for use by reporters and might help you in your reporting for the next few weeks and months. Our next guest will be Ted Alden. Ted was once bureau chief of the Financial Times in Washington, and he covered NAFTA and WTO before going on to glory at the Council on Foreign Relations. I commend to you his book, which is called Failure to Adjust. And well, the title says it all. Ted will give a global overview and some tips for journalists as well. And finally, Ling Wei of the Wall Street Journal, co-author with Bob Davis of Superpower Showdown, which came out this spring, which is a marvelous history of the US-China trade war. Several journalists have sent in questions by email ahead of this show, and I've asked the panelists to address them. We'll also have Q&A. If you have a question, raise your Zoom hand. That's the little green button on the bottom of your screen, and we'll give the microphone over to you. You can also drop a question into the Q&A text function. And please tweet today at #NPFTrade. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'll turn the floor over first to Mary Lovely. Welcome, Mary.
Thanks so much, Sunny. It's great to be here with Ted and Ling, and I hope we have a very productive session. I'm going to share my screen now. I've prepared some slides that I hope will help us to begin the conversation. Here we go. So it's about the U.S. and the U.S. election and trade. Does it matter? And as a trade economist, you can probably guess that I think the answer to that question is yes, it does matter. Trade policy matters, first of all, because many U.S. jobs depend on exporting and importing. The Business Roundtable suggests that about 1 in 5 U.S. jobs depend on trade. If we look forward to the next generation, we will know that international markets will be more, not less important for younger Americans during their working lives, in large part because the rest of the global economy will grow faster than the U.S. economy. And that means that more of their jobs will be tied to exporting and importing by the U.S. and the rules of the road for global trade. The U.S. crafted that system and leads the world trading system. And as such, our behavior creates norms. I think a question we're moving forward is, do we want to craft a system of rules and follow them? Or do we want to pursue a more unilateral approach, as President Trump has done? Global cooperation on trade is going to be essential to handling key transnational threats, including climate change, which President-elect Biden has said will be among his top priorities, as well as terrorism and nuclear proliferation. So all of these different means of international relations come together in U.S. trade policy. Now, President Trump and President-elect Biden differ on U.S. engagement with the world in quite stark ways. President Trump has run on a platform of America First. He has declared himself a tariff man, very proudly. President-elect Biden, on the other hand, is seen as more of an alliance man. He has a long career working with allies and has repeated in his campaign platform that working with allies and reinvigorating international engagement will be important to his pursuit of reinvigorating the U.S. economy, as well as dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. President Trump has presided over a radical shift in U.S. trade policy. Sometimes the extent to which the shift was really different than previous administrations, as I think underreported. U.S. trade policy aimed at reinforcing U.S. manufacturing base and rebalancing U.S. merchandise trade. That probably is not that surprising. Many previous presidents have spoken about the importance of U.S. manufacturing and decried the perils of a very large trade deficit. However, President Trump's administration took this much further by prioritizing bilateral talks with major trading partners in which the U.S. sought to gain advantages as part of its America First policy. Regional initiatives, WTO initiatives, were given lower priority or disrupted. So, for example, one of the first acts by President Trump was to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is true that under the Trump administration, there was the renewed NAFTA accord called the USMCA by the United States, but much of that, the rewrite on NAFTA was either, followed the rules that have been set under U.S. negotiations for TPP, or frankly, roll back market access to the United States. The president and his cabinet have pushed U.S. firms, at least through their rhetoric, to restructure supply chains to source more components in the United States. And in some cases, they have actively claimed that the U.S.-China trade war was for that purpose, partly to pull American multinationals back to sourcing from the United States. The administration has aggressively used U.S. unfair trade law, Section 301, and national security law, Section 232 statutes to impose import tariffs. And as many of you know, they have disabled the World Trade Organization dispute settlement procedures by failing to approve appellate court judges, and most recently by deciding not to support Dr. Ngozi, who was the otherwise consensus choice to lead the WTO as Director General. Now, how did President Trump handle China, one of the most high-profile issues on the trade agenda? He, first of all, levied very high tariffs, and these will be hard for President-elect Biden to unravel. We imposed restrictive U.S. controls on high-tech exports, especially those related to semiconductors. We imposed tighter screening of Chinese investment coming into the United States through an updated CFIUS legislation. We imposed new restrictions on visas for Chinese nationals, sanctions on Chinese officials and entities related to policies in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And lastly, in a different vein, President Trump signed a phase one deal with China that promised purchases of U.S. exports by China. I'll take a deeper look at a couple of these, beginning with the U.S. Tariffs on Chinese imports and China's reaction to those. This is a nice graph that was originally done by Chad Bown and is updated regularly. There's a link here in the slide. The blue is the tariffs as they are increasing over time in value for the United States against U.S. Imports from China. The red are Chinese tariffs on U.S. goods. We see that by the middle of 2020, there were tariffs of about 20% by the United States on Chinese exports and by China on U.S. exports. Not shown here is the fact that 2/3 of imports going each way were subject to tariff. It's important to look back and see that U.S. tariffs by the end of the trade war were 6 times higher on average than they had been prior to the trade war. So this was a very significant deterioration in U.S.-China trade relations. If we look at Chinese investment into the United States, we had seen that it was rising, particularly after 2015. This is a chart that was done by a colleague of mine at the Peterson Institute, Martin Torzempa. It's a new chart, and you can see that Chinese, the red part, the number of Chinese investments in the United States was increasing. A share of them were aimed at U.S. technology companies. Chinese investment into the United States has fallen dramatically since the beginning of the U.S.-China trade war. And right now, cases that are referred to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, that are from China has fallen to third. It's only about 28 cases in 2019. You can see that more investment from the EU has been subject to review, as well as from Japan and from Canada. Now, how well did President Trump's policies work in achieving his goals? Well, very quickly, we know that taxes were not paid by China. And in fact, the extent to which the tariffs were paid by American consumers and businesses, I have to say, was frankly surprising, even to seasoned international trade economists. But now we have ample evidence from detailed analysis of US customs data that shows that the prices that we paid to Chinese exporters did not budge on average. And in fact, it's hard to find much variation by different types of goods. That evidence shows that the tax was passed forward to US consumers and businesses. Downstream businesses, for example, those who use steel, President Trump placed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports for many of our allies. Downstream businesses paid higher input taxes as a result of the Trump-led tariff surge. The tax is worth about $1,600 per worker in affected firms, that is manufacturing firms that buy inputs that are now subject to taxes. New estimates from economists show that about 200,000 job losses resulted from these new tariffs. So on net, the tariffs were a job buster, not a job creator. Retaliation by our partners has hurt American businesses, and particularly American farms. All of the import taxes paid by Americans have been distributed as farm aid. That at least this is the import taxes that were collected from China, from the purchase of Chinese imports from China. Overall, the U.S. trade deficit and the trade deficit with China are larger today than they were in 2016. So by any of these metrics, the policies have not worked to achieve their stated goals. We can look at the Trump administration's phase one deal with China and ask if that was a success. A key feature of that deal is purchasing targets, which are divided into 4 separate categories of goods. One that President Trump is particularly focused on was the purchasing targets for U.S. agricultural products. There have been a number of objections raised about the phase one deal, including that meeting the targets, which are very aggressive, would require the Chinese government to mandate purchases by its companies. Exactly the opposite of market reform, which is what the United States has said it seeks in China. The thorniest problems that were addressed in the original Section 301 investigation of Chinese practices, such as Chinese state subsidies, have been left unaddressed by phase one and left aside for phase two, if it ever comes. Now, if we look at the U.S.-China phase one purchases, and this is a U.S.-China phase one tracker that is done by the Peterson Institute, you can see that with the dark lines here, that China is way below the path, the dotted line here, that they would need to be on if they're going to achieve the purchases that they say they will achieve within 2 years. It is, of course, always possible that they'll make big purchases in the second year, but right now China is making progress, but clearly not on track to achieve the very aggressive goals. The America First policy has certainly eroded U.S. alliances over the last 4 years. The U.S. is increasingly viewed as a blocker in many international efforts. The Trump administration has pulled us out of the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. It has disabled dispute settlement procedures as a WTO by failing to approve the appellate judge appointments. It says withdrawn from the World Trade Organization. I'm sorry, that means the World Health Organization. I have to correct that on the slide. It's used U.S. monetary dominance to enforce unilateral sanctions against international actors. It has failed to promote new agreements on digital trade, taxation of multinational corporations, and digital taxation, issues that have been very important, particularly to our European allies. Now, looking ahead, what is President-elect Biden likely to do? We know and expect clearly from his history that President-elect Biden will work more closely with Western allies and use international institutions to promote new global initiatives. This is, of course, realizing that his first-year focus is going to have to be on the domestic agenda, in particularly getting the COVID-19 outbreak under control and reviving U.S. economy. He is expected to revitalize U.S. engagement with the World Trade Organization, notwithstanding the fact that he's likely to seek changes and reforms at the WTO, particularly related to some of the concerns that predate the Trump administration, but then came to a head under the Trump administration, related to U.S. use of anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Later, we would expect that President Biden would want to update free trade agreements to have stronger obligations in labor and environmental issues. Here we have to remember that the USMCA passed Congress by getting support from a Democratic House by having stronger rules on labor standards and environmental standards. And we're clearly expecting President Biden to use subsidies to propel U.S. innovation, as per his platform, to remove national security tariffs against our allies, and in particular to broaden Buy America preferences for public procurement. This is something that he has promised, and we're almost sure to see. Okay, having said that President-elect Biden will be focused on the domestic economy, we can say that he will need to engage on trade. The domestic economy will be Biden's focus, but there's going to be continued need to create strategic alliances and engagement in other areas. Other countries are moving ahead and setting new rules and standards without the U.S. This weekend, we saw the signing of the Regional Comprehensive and Economic Partnership in Asia. And the Biden administration will want to move ahead to address some of those ongoing activities. China is moving ahead with industrial policies and deeper integration in Asia and Africa. These moves are surely going to have to shape the Biden administration's response to China and update the approach that inherits from the Trump administration. One of the things I found interesting is the statement, "No toolkit contains only hammers." President Trump has liked hammers, including tariffs. We'll have to see whether Biden's coalition will permit the U.S. to roll back tariffs, rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or lead reforms at the World Trade Organization. In other words, will it allow for deeper engagement as well as rollback in some of the hammers that we've already used? Okay, I'll leave it there and pass it back to Sunny.
Mary, thank you so much for that overview. And for those of you who are joining us late, Dr. Lovely's slides will be posted on our website after this, and as will an interactive transcript. So for the journalists on the phone frantically taking notes, you will have an interactive transcript tomorrow on the website that you can use. Before I turn it over to Ted Alden, just a quick question. This is a political question. So President-elect Biden has promised to focus on the middle class, and he built a blue wall in part to, appeal to voters who, have been hurt economically, both before the pandemic and after the pandemic. But, Mary Lovely's data says that, Trump's policies have cost $1,600 per worker in the affected areas and 200,000 jobs. Whether or not the American public believes those statistics, we're going to leave that question aside. But as you give us the way forward, Ted, could you talk about, how a President-elect Biden needs to go about kind of winning back the workers that he did not carry, many of whom are non-college educated, who did not vote for him, but in fact are the intended targets of his trade policies? Over to you with that easy question.
Thanks very much, Sunny. If I knew the answer to that, he'd probably hire me. Anyway, look, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Great to be here with Mary and Lingling. What I'm going to try to do here is just take Mary's excellent overview and distill it into some stories that journalists should be watching in 2021. I will mostly not talk about the U.S. and China because Lingling is our expert on that. And I'm going to let her talk more about that. So U.S. trade policy in 2021, 6 stories to watch. So Mary mentioned this in her overview. One of the most dramatic things that we have seen in the past several years, and it's still TBD exactly how dramatic it will turn out to be, but we are seeing a reorganization of global supply chains. U.S.-China conflict has had a lot to do with that, particularly in high technology sectors. President-elect Biden, if you look at his quite detailed campaign promises on this issue, has promised to implement what he calls fundamental reforms that shift production of a whole range of products back to U.S. soil. So he's talking about a reshoring of significant chunks of manufacturing that have moved overseas, a lot of it to Asia. The sectors that are targeted make sense for people paying attention to what's going on with the pandemic, but he's not just talking about medical equipment and PPE and critical medical supplies, but also looking at technologies like energy and grid resilience, semiconductors. U.S. is still very dependent on fabrication in Taiwan in particular, key electronics technologies, telecommunications infrastructure for anybody who's been following the issues between the United States and Huawei, and key raw materials like rare earths, which are so critical for high technology applications. This is going to be a story that will have many dimensions, in the coming year and beyond. Questions about which industries are the winners and losers in this reshuffling of supply chains. What are the costs for taxpayers? There are bills that have been thrown around in Congress that talk about spending $25 billion of taxpayer money to encourage reshoring of semiconductor production, for example. So there are going to be real issues here about taxpayer-supported subsidies to try to encourage this reshoring. So, I mean, if I were going to go report these stories, you can do it a lot of different ways. You can guarantee that state and local economic development officials across the country are going to be looking into this. What are the industries that we might be able to attract to our cities and states? Every city, every state has these economic development officials. Supply chain managers at your local companies. I've had a lot of conversations over the last year with supply chain officials from multinationals thinking about how vulnerable are we in China? What if there's an escalation in U.S.-China tension? Do we have a plan B and a plan C? Think tanks and universities. I've got supply chain experts in think tanks. I actually think the universities are a better bet here. If you look at business schools, they all have supply chain experts paying attention to this. Commerce Department has got officials working on this, and then I'll talk a little more about this subsequently, but trade associations are a great resource for journalists, not just the big comprehensive ones like the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce, but every specific industry, Semiconductor Industry Association, for example, has trade associations in Washington focused on these issues. So those are great folks to talk to for these stories. A second story, tariffs and more, possibly fewer tariffs. Mary outlined this extremely well in terms of the departure we've seen under the Trump administration. The WTO was supposed to mean that countries didn't unilaterally impose tariffs on each other anymore. They only did so following decisions by dispute panels in the WTO. Now we see, led by the United States, but other countries doing this as well, imposing tariffs unilaterally. Biden has not said how quickly he's going to move on this tariff issue, whether he's going to move to lift some of the tariffs on China or the steel and aluminum tariffs on Europe. But there will be stories right out of the block with companies that have been harmed by the tariffs pressing the administration to either remove them, or there's a whole special procedure in which companies can apply for exemptions from the tariffs that the Trump administration has used quite conservatively. A Biden administration may be more generous on that front. There's a whole list of sectors there that have been affected by tariffs. Again, depending on where you're reporting from, there are probably some of these industries in your jurisdiction. So again, this is very much a win-lose kind of story. What kind of pressure is Biden going to face to lift the tariffs? Ling can talk about how the Chinese might respond to this, and which companies, sectors, and regions are going to win and lose in this. Again, trade associations, local officials from affected companies, trade lawyers are a great resource for any story having to do with tariffs. I mean, companies that are applying, for instance, for exemptions from the tariffs in Washington are hiring trade lawyers, most of them based in DC, but sometimes in other places, who are putting together their claims for the US government. So getting to know the trade lawyers who are working for companies that you're concerned about is a great resource. Academic economists like Mary at the Peterson Institute are great. I think, my think tank, Jennifer Hillman, is fabulous on this stuff. CSIS has got Bill Reinchen other people there. Brookings has got some great people. Again, state and local economic development officials paying attention to this, because the tariffs are either helping or hurting their industry. Actually, one I should have included under here as well is labor union officials, because they often, again, have a big stake in what happens to companies where their workers are employed. Third story I would keep an eye on, the U.S. place in the Asia-Pacific trading order. I think, again, putting U.S.-China bilateral to the side right for the moment, the question of the U.S. place in Asia, I think, is the big international economic question for the next decade and beyond. As Mary suggested, President-elect Biden has said he's not going to go out immediately looking for new trade agreements in Asia or anywhere else. He's said quite explicitly he's not going to pursue further trade deals until we've made major investments here at home in our workers and our communities. That would seem to make impossible any quick U.S. effort to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Trump pulled out of on his first day in office. U.S. allies in Asia want the United States back in the TPP. I think I get a call every week from a reporter in New Zealand asking me what are the prospects for the U.S. rejoining the TPP. There's a lot of concern in that region. And Mary mentioned the recent conclusion of the RCEP, which involves China and Japan and South Korea and the ASEAN countries. And so China is building a trade architecture in Asia. So there's a real question about what is the U.S. place going to be in this, the most dynamic region in the world. There was a great piece in Bloomberg magazine this month on how Asia is returning to its position at the center of the global economy. The question is how the U.S. will engage. This is politically very complicated for the Biden administration. So there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who are not particularly enthusiastic about TPP or an active trade agenda in Asia. And it's, remains to be seen how the Republicans are going to respond to a Democratic president on this issue. They are willing to go along with President Trump, but may not be with the President Biden. Here, your sources go outside the sort of trade world. If you've got Washington correspondents, obviously looking for contacts at the State Department and the White House and other places. I found when I was reporting that embassy representatives are fabulous here. The representatives in Washington for all of the Asian countries are very plugged into what's going on in DC, very obviously aware of their own country's interests. If you can build relations there, that's incredibly valuable. Academic and think tank experts, again, useful here. And there's some good ones, specifically dealing with Asia, the Asia Society, where Wendy Cutler is now the vice president. She was the lead negotiator for the TPP. It's fabulous. Sunny didn't pay me to add this, but the Heinrich Foundation, my friend Steve Olson works for them out of Thailand. He's a great analyst of the region. He's got a new piece just out on the RCEP. And the Lowy Institute in Australia, Richard McGregor, who was a colleague of mine at the Financial Times, is one of the world's leading experts on China. And a final resource I'd suggest, look at congressional staff on key committees, House Foreign Affairs, Senate Foreign Relations. Congressional staff are often very up on the latest and sometimes freer to talk than administration officials. Number 4, can the WTO survive? Mary really gave a good overview here. I mean, I was, one of the highlights of my reporting career was being in Geneva for the final negotiations of the Uruguay round that created the WTO. The history books are going to record that this was an extraordinary organization that for about 25 years provided a fair degree of stability to the rules of global trade. That is unraveling in various ways now, and there would be big stories in terms of to what extent can the WTO be stitched back together. I think the Biden administration will want to engage with Europe and with other countries on this, and some things to look for. Does the U.S. lift the hold on new appointments to the appellate body, which is the WTO's highest court? And does the U.S. change course with respect to who's going to be the WTO's next director general? Nigerian American Ngozi is the consensus candidate, but the U.S. for bizarre reasons is blocking her candidacy. That could change under a Biden administration. I think this is a particularly interesting story for reporters working in smaller economies. the WTO is a great thing for smaller economies that don't have the kind of economic muscle that a US or the European Union or China has. And so for those countries, the future of the WTO is incredibly important. So kind of the usual suspects here, though again, I found historically Geneva representatives for all these countries a great potential source for you. Closer to home here in North America, I would watch really carefully what happens with the US, Mexico, Canada agreement and labor. The biggest change between the new USMCA and the old NAFTA is the labor enforcement provisions, and a lot of this was at the insistence of House Democrats, are the most robust we've ever seen in a trade agreement. It includes what's known as a rapid response mechanism. So if the US believes that a particular company is failing to allow union organizing in its plant, there's a provision for a quick complaint, a quick investigation, and potentially targeted tariffs on the exports from that specific plant. That's a far more aggressive procedure than we have ever seen in a trade agreement before. And the Biden administration, I suspect, will be under early pressure from the AFL-CIO and other labor union officials. Be a great source on this story to make good on the promise to enforce this aggressively. So I think this is going to be a big issue between the United States and Mexico, one that's likely, I think, to raise some tensions pretty quickly. So that's one I'd watch. And then just one last one, a sort of neat half dozen. What are we going to do with respect to Europe? I think Mary's right. The biggest, I think, philosophical difference between the Trump administration and what we will see in a Biden administration is Biden is very pro-alliance. And for the United States, that means being pro-Europe. Donald Trump hammered the Europeans very hard over NATO. And if you look on the trade front, the Europeans were on the receiving end of the steel and aluminum tariffs and a series of threats by President Trump to put tariffs on European auto exports. Biden will try to make up with the Europeans. I don't think there's any question, but there are some big issues out there. I mean, Airbus and Boeing, sort of 20-year-old dispute. It's actually really a 40-year-old dispute. I started covering in 1992, and it predated even that. But we now have billions of dollars in tariffs in place on both sides. It affects a lot of industries, not just aircraft sales. There's a great piece, Bloomberg this morning, about Delta trying to circumvent the tariffs on Airbus aircraft coming into the U.S. But if you've got alcoholic beverage distillers in any of your districts, they've all been whacked by this. Brexit's got a whole set of complications. The Biden administration much less supportive than the Trump administration was. And then Mary flagged this one, but there's a big fight looming with the French in particular over taxation of digital companies. The Europeans feel like the American digital giants are getting away scot-free in terms of paying taxes in Europe. So it's a big issue both for US-Europe relations and for the specific tech companies. I apologize for the typo there, European diplomats in Washington. I will fix that. But again, kind of the usual sources, but Europeans in Washington are great. The lovely thing about the Europeans in Washington is you have member state representatives, British, French, German. You also have the European Union. And you can often get them both to talk. And sometimes they don't say the same things, which is great, because then you can go back and forth and say, what's actually going on here? And there are also some think tanks that are very good on Europe. The German Marshall Fund, the Atlantic Council, the AICGS, the American Council on Germany, based in New York, Chatham House in London, ACP in Brussels. So there's a broader range of think tanks that you can go to for those stories. So I will stop it there. We are all on Twitter, by the way, which is a great way to follow some of these trade debates. So thank you very much, Sunny. I will stop the share and turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in by email, chat, and people raising their hands. Before we turn to, and I promise we will get to all of you eventually, but before we turn to Ling Ling for the view on China and how this is all being seen from Beijing's point of view, and also to what extent what's going on with U.S. companies. Ted mentioned some. I just want to turn it over for a moment to some questions about the domestic situation. We have David Murray from Waterways Journal and High Plains Journal, a senior writer. David, Tyler, can you unmute David to ask his question?
Thank you, and good morning, and thank all of you. My question is about the recent large purchases of agricultural products by China, and whether, in the panel's opinion, this has any phase one or the response to internal demands coming from within China, like the rebuilding of their hog herd and so on.
Ling Ling, do you want to tackle that one, or you want to pass?
Sure. Obviously, Ted and Mary, feel free to add any, points to the question. Thank you, David. I think, it's because of both. Definitely internally in China, the demand for hogs are, rising as well. And obviously, China still has the intention to implement the phase one trade agreement. One of the, as we mentioned yesterday when Sonny and all the other panelists were preparing for this seminar today, we basically were talking about, there's still 10 weeks to go, right, before the next administration. And there's still a number of things the Trump administration can do to further worsen the ties between Beijing and Washington. So right now, the leadership in Zhongnanhai in Beijing, the last thing they want to do is to further provoke Trump, right? Cause a complete collapse of the relationship. So in the near term, at least on the Chinese side, they have every intention and desire to keep phase one going.
Okay, well, thanks. So Ling Ling, let me turn it over to you for an overview, the view from Beijing. What kind of mood do you think Xi Jinping is in right now? And how do you see this playing out, both for the next 10 weeks, as you pointed out? Trump administration is not over, and also going forward.
Sure. First of all, I should say thank you very much for having me on here. It's such a pleasure to basically share this panel with Mary and Ted. What's the mood in Beijing these days? One thing that's really interesting is that in the past, during the past US elections, the Chinese leadership, just probably like, the rest of the world, they would make their own projections. Right, back in 2016, Beijing's bet was on Hillary Clinton, and their diplomats in Washington made early outreach attempts to the Hillary Clinton campaign. Not this time around. They didn't make any projection within Zhongnanhai at all, because to the Chinese leadership, whoever in the White House in the next 5 years or 4 years really doesn't change the fundamental nature of the relationship anymore. For China, the past 2 years of trade war has made the leadership conclude that the US is no longer a reliable partner. So, what they're doing, they're pursuing a policy agenda that aims at really protecting China's interest from growing pressure from the US and other Western democracies. This whole dual circulation policy slogan is really more about internal circulation, which means prioritizing domestic markets, domestic companies, and domestic industries, just make sure that, in Xi Jinping's own words, is, manage our own affairs well. So they have much inward turning focus these days. But at the same time, at least in some corners of the Chinese government, there is, after Mr. Joe Biden won the election, at least declared that he won the election, there was a sense of relief in many corners of Chinese government. The whole trade war and the cascade of sanctions against China over the past few months really got many Chinese officials really exhausted. They're probably also like the rest of us here, and journalists and economists alike, kind of hoping for a break, right? But at the same time, it's in some ways it's wishful thinking, as Mary and Ted just laid out very clearly. The Biden administration is not going to soften its approach toward China probably in any way. If anything, he, as Mary put it, he's the alliance man, right? He's going to be more strategic, potentially also more patient. Unlike Trump, he wanted to completely change China in a year, right? Good luck there. So we're just joking with a friend back in Beijing. Maybe 2 years from now, China will miss Trump in some way. Obviously, there's a realization in Beijing that it's very hard to go back to where the relationship was, before Trump came to power. And China's own policy, this domestic focused inward turning policy, also means China is increasingly on divergent paths from that of the US. So the confrontation, the further confrontation is really inevitable. And faced with a potentially more strategic Biden administration that might renew its focus on building allies and work with allies to confront China, China is being very preemptive now. Both Ted and Mary talked about RCEP, this regional agreement, right? And Xi Jinping recently also talked about, cutting trade deals with Europe. That's, of course, it's easier said than done because the potential BIT with Europe would require a lot of more concessions from China than RCEP. RCEP, in some ways is a limited trade agreement. It doesn't really cover a lot of the thorny issues we know that exist, like industrial policy, state-owned enterprise subsidies and all that. But still, it's a huge win for China. Right now, China actually can enjoy very low tariffs with countries like Japan and South Korea and Australia, right? So this is something they didn't have before. It's a huge, at least based on what I know, people in Beijing very happy about it. They're going to obviously step up their effort in that regard. But when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship per se, one thing, internally with my colleagues and my, friends, I always, there's this one question I always thought about is, generations of Chinese leaders, they have always been judged by how they handle the relationship between China and the US. Mao Zedong, for all the mistakes he made, he's credited for building this formal ties with Washington. Deng Xiaoping further advanced it, and Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao both, deepened it further. Xi Jinping doesn't want to be the one who would be blamed for losing America. So that, that really, because for him, the top priority in the next 2.5 years is a smooth ride into his third term without any challenge, both inside and outside the party. He wants, he's basically want to hold on power, very secured. But this potential problems in U.S.-China relationship really are emerging as one of the biggest threat to that, smooth ride he is desiring. So he's not going to be too aggressive and provocative in terms of, trying just, destroy the relationship completely. However, he's also built up this image as a very strong leader, right? Most forceful, powerful, ideologically driven Chinese leader in recent history. He cannot back down either. So he's kind of also in a dilemma. Both Ted and Mary talked about what the Biden administration can do, right, to improve its ties with allies, with China. The same question is for the Chinese side as well. What China can do to improve ties with the US, if indeed they don't want to destroy the relationship completely? And would they offer any kind of new voice? Would they offer any kind of new approach to this US-China relationship? That's something I think all of us will be on the lookout for. So I'll maybe just pause there.
Well, Ling, thanks for that marvelous overview and the great observation about Xi Jinping doesn't want to be the guy who lost China, who lost America. Can I bring you back to a question that we've touched on a lot in the last 10 programs, but never really addressed completely, that I think will be a problem for any administration next up and for Xi Jinping. What do you think China will do about the issue of international property theft? This is not a partisan issue. There's rising ire, I think, across the spectrum in the United States, certainly in Congress. There's, lots of Democrats who are extremely exercised about the issue, who feel that that it hasn't been censored, that the Trump administration made a number of, attempts to censor, to whack them, to punish them, to retaliate, but really hasn't cracked the underlying issue. And this is something that I think, will continue to be a wedge. What is your sense of how Xi Jinping sees that issue, and whether he would be able to, without publicly, as you say, losing face or conceding or losing his mantle of the great Chinese leader, can he do anything about this? Does he want to? And could he? And would that be an olive branch that he could reach over to Biden, or is it not in his interest to do that because, as you say, he's pursuing a Chinese nationalist, domestic industry first policy?
Sure, that's a great question. I do believe the Chinese government, including the very top leader, has every intention to address the IP protection issue. I mean, it's not just about protecting foreign companies, it's also about protecting China's own companies. There's so many private businesses in China, complaining to the government, oh, this SOEO2 just stole my IP. It's really as much a domestic issue as it is an international issue. They have every intention to do it. However, what Xi Jinping doesn't want is to be seen as somehow being pressured to take steps to address the IP protection issue, especially pressured by the U.S. They have to move, based on their own pace and make sure that people understand it is in China's interest to address the issue. China is doing this voluntarily without pressure from the U.S. This is something that's very different from 20 years ago, right? Back then, foreign pressure was really good for reform, for market changes in China. Not anymore, because in Xi Jinping's view, China has already risen. It's, at least economically, China should be treated as an equal to the Americans. So the days of China being bossed around basically over. So they want to do things that's good for the China's economy. They don't want to do things that make it look like China is being pressured to do that. I think that's that's one thing the Trump administration really, one area Trump administration seemed to have made mistakes, because I just find it amazing. They seem not capable of thinking what it takes for the other side to cut a deal with you. They just think about what I want. This is what I want. This is what I want to accomplish. But how about the political constraints in your opponent's country? So I think for really good deal maker or politician, many years down the road, that's something really needs to be considered. What needs to really, if you China really is not enemy. If you because all the U.S. companies, you talked about that earlier, especially TED, the supply chains and all that. All the U.S. companies, most of them still want to be in China, even though now they're probably not expanding because the geopolitical uncertainty. So with all that interest remaining there, so it's really falls upon the government to figure out approach to make sure the relationship still functioning, not like right now it's just like no talk, no dialogue. All you see is just basically sanctions upon sanctions, just for the sake of being tough on China.
Okay. Thank you, Ling Ling. So we have on this Zoom a number of very distinguished people, including some members of various governments and some of our former panelists on different trade issues who could probably answer some of these questions themselves. But I'm going to give precedence in asking questions to journalists because we are the National Press Foundation, and we'll keep going for as long as we can. Let me question here from Chris Johnson for Mary Lovely. Mary, you said economists were surprised by the amount Americans had to pay in taxes as a result of Trump's tariffs. Is there any evidence that Americans instead bought U.S. made as a result of the tariffs?
So the first statement had to do with the fact that, we felt there was a belief that the U.S. had market power that would force Chinese exporters to reduce their prices to continue to sell into the United States. And therefore, there was some belief that some of the tax would be passed backward to the Chinese exporters themselves. I think that view had to do with China, with the U.S. being such a large market, but it also missed the very important fact about U.S.-China trade, which is that much of it takes place from foreign invested enterprises operating in China. In other words, it's multinational to multinational trade, or even trade within a multinational. So, one part of a U.S. corporation to another. So what we do know now is that most of it was passed forward. Now, how much have sales turned to the U.S.? Frankly, we really don't know. What we do know is that because the trade data and the U.S. consumption data are fundamentally different. They're kept by different authorities. And of course, we were hit with a series of other shocks, including most recently this year, COVID-19, which really crashed consumption. What we do know is that the tariffs did affect the value of U.S. imports from China. Causally, we think about a 30% decrease on average. So they were powerful in affecting flows. However, much of that trade was diverted to other parts of Asia and Mexico, and particularly trade that is mediated by multinational enterprises. An example here is, of course, Giant Bicycle, which has been widely reported in the press as shifting its production of bicycles destined for the U.S. from mainland China over to its factories in Taiwan. So it escapes then the tariffs, and it can continue to export from its mainland China factories to other locations. So companies that had multiple factories in multiple countries were able to shift production in a way that accommodated the U.S. tariffs. So I guess the answer is we don't really know. What we do know is that a lot of it seems to have moved to other parts of Asia, into Mexico, and that leaves very little that has moved back to the U.S.
Okay, thank you. Another question here about unpaid debts. China's unpaid debts. Biden clearly will be on the money hunt. Do you think the Biden administration will go after the unpaid anti-dumping and countervailing duties owed by China, which is over $3.2 billion? Either of you want to take that?
Mary might have a better response, but I think that, again, reflects a misunderstanding. So when there's an anti-dumping or a countervailing duty, it's paid by the American importer of the product. I'm not clear where that 3.2 billion figure comes from. That might be duties that are owed by the American importers. Perhaps that refers to efforts to circumvent duties, which you do see sometimes, where China might be transshipping the product through a third country to try to escape the tariffs. That's something that Customs and Border Protection tries to pay a lot of attention to. But yeah, I don't know where that 3 billion figure comes from. But if there's money owed, it's not owed by China. It's owed by the American importers who brought the product into the United States.
Thank you. Okay, question from Dan Vogt from States Newsroom reporter. Dan says, can you talk about the impact on the change in administration on agricultural trade? Mary, back to your point about the tariffs. Will the Biden administration likely take a wait and see approach, or is there anything it can do to encourage more agricultural trade with China?
Well, the approach to, first of all, that a lot of the imports the Chinese imports of U.S. agricultural products crashed with the retaliatory tariffs. The Trump administration main way to try to encourage that was through the phase one deal and very aggressive targets for China in terms of purchasing U.S. agricultural products. At the same time, the Trump administration invested money in trying to help farmers create new markets. So, for example, we've seen them push with several of our trading partners to get them to lower tariffs on it may not be, it's not a mainline agricultural product, but it was very important to Maine, which is the lobsters, pushing to reduce tariffs to levels that were enjoyed by the CPTPP partners, which we could have enjoyed, but of course we didn't because President Trump pulled out of TPP. So they have engaged in a number of ways to try to build markets. The problem is that farmers built those markets in China over a 20-year period. It's very hard to instantly turn around and create new markets. They're built on trust. Oftentimes, it's overlooked that U.S. agricultural products are customized to the needs of their customers, so that these relationships represent, long-term investments by U.S. producers. So this cannot be turned around on a dime. How President-elect Biden will approach this is difficult to see. As I have said in other places, I think that if there is going to be some kind of rapprochement with China on this, there's going to have to be negotiations before that between the Chinese and the Americans that de-escalate the conflict and result in some other wins, I think, perhaps for both sides. So we have to wait and see how this works out. No easy fix.
Sunny, could I just add very quickly? I noticed, we had on this call Jill O'Donnell, who runs the Yider Institute for International Trade and Finance at the University of Nebraska. That's a great source for people looking of, what does the farm community want from U.S. trade policy, particularly sort of big Midwest farm community. So there are a lot of good sources out there for reporters in the heartland looking to cover these stories.
Right. I would add that one of the first programs that we did after the pandemic was a program called Where's Our Food? And we had also excellent sources from across the industry. And you'll see in the chat, you can look at the link, and in there you will find the previous programs and also, great list of sources that I think will be helpful. Let me turn from agriculture to pharmaceuticals. And Lingling, I don't know if you want to take this one, or Mary. Are U.S. pharma companies, this is from a reporter in London, by the way, are U.S. pharma companies still investing as heavily in China after Trump's trade war has had an effect?
I don't know the latest numbers on U.S. pharma FDI, for example, into China. What we do know, though, is that pharma is definitely on the front line in terms of this decoupling effort in pharmaceuticals. And the incoming Biden administration, as well as the Trump administration, have spoken about the need to reshore medicines and medical supplies, as have many other countries. So I would guess, and I don't have the numbers to back it up, that there's a pause for pharma. Having said that, we have to recognize that there is a very, very active community, R&D community that spans U.S., China, and other parts of the world. That R&D in this area is truly global, involves talent from all over the world. And then any sort of talk of decoupling here, I think, it really misses the deep and enduring links that will persist in pharma and other types of biochemical and biological sciences.
Sunny, sorry, I apologize for continuing to do this, but for people who are looking to track trade and investment in specific industries, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but Panjiva, which is an arm of Standard & Poor's, S&P, they've got a great analyst in London named Chris Rogers, and who does a deep dive into all of these. So if anybody has the answer to that question of what's the latest in terms of the trends of U.S. investment, he's probably the guy. So I would suggest reaching out to him. It's Panjiva is the name of the organization.
Yeah, I
Okay.
agree with Ted. That's a great source, but we should also look for market access. That the Americans have complained that their goods are being kept out of China as China seeks to develop its own domestic enterprises. So we should be also looking at market access. That is exports, not just investment. It's clear that U.S. companies are continuing to invest in China, that they like the look of the market. China, of course, bouncing back much faster than the rest of the world to the COVID-19 crisis. So we're going to see heavy investment. Much of it, I might add, going in as wholly owned foreign affiliates of foreign companies. So the new foreign investment law that went into effect in January of this year, plus other liberalizations by China, partly in response to pressures on allegations of IP theft, have certainly are changing the landscape for foreign companies operating in China.
Okay. Panelists, we still have a few more questions. Are you able to, do we need to wrap this up, or can you stay on another couple minutes? Everybody good?
I can stay for 5 more minutes because I need to go to school, pick up my son. I'm sorry about
Okay.
that.
Well, thank you. Well, let me take one last question. This is very interesting, not from a journalist, but very good question on enforcement of the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement. What do you think a Biden administration will focus on most? Rapid response toward Mexico labor conditions, Canadian milk classes, TRQs. What's the enforcement priorities for the Biden administration?
I strongly expect the labor enforcement will be the top priority. I mean, if you look at the political problem that the Biden administration has on trade, it has to reassure, union leading Democrats that whatever trade agenda it pursues is consistent with an expansion of labor rights. I throw an environmental protection in there as well. So I think the Biden administration is going to want to set down a marker pretty quickly that it is determined to enforce the agreements that Mexico made under the USMCA and to be seen publicly as enforcing them. I mean, Canadian milk is a problem up in Wisconsin, but it doesn't move votes in the Democratic Party the same way labor rights in Mexico does. So I think that will clearly be the priority.
Will anything move votes in Georgia, panelists?
Are there any peanut issues out there, Mary? I don't know. I don't think so.
Ling-Ling,
I
if
trust
China
that
wants to
votes
tip
that
the
are being
elections,
counted as we speak.
Ling-Ling, if Beijing wants to make a difference, and we've seen, by the way, interesting evidence about China, adjusting its own policies with an eye to the U.S. electoral map. Does China have any interest in Georgia that are relevant here? Ling-Ling, you're muted.
Sorry, the Chinese definitely have been watching this whole election saga with a lot of interest and amusement. I think, they're definitely doing their own calculations as well. During the trade war, I just remember, when President Trump first started to levy tariffs on Chinese imports, the Chinese officials just looking at the US electoral map, which parts of the country Trump supporters. So that's the first batch of tariffs China hit on the U.S. Right, the farm states, not provinces. I'm sorry, farm states.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, just more seriously, I mean, Atlanta is the hub of express delivery services in the United States, and they have been harmed by the slowing of global trade as a result of both the trade war and the pandemic. So from a sort of interest perspective, anything that helps to speed up trade is good for Atlanta's economy. Whether that actually moves votes in the Senate runoff, who knows? But it would help Georgia.
I think it would be interesting to watch if the incoming Biden administration links regional development policies to trade. Some of the advisors have written about this. I was on a call where we had Malcolm Turnbull of Australia saying his first advice to President-elect Biden would be to banish the word Rust Belt and to move in aggressively with opportunity zones or other types of devices to try to, in a sense, fulfill his promise of making a more inclusive economy by hooking more of these places into foreign market opportunities. That will require him to engage to make sure that, in particular, we begin to remove some of the international barriers to U.S. services. This is basically a service economy. There's so much focus on manufacturing, and of course, that's important. But it's important to recognize that more than 80% of Americans work in the service sector, and that there's a lot of services that the U.S. is a leading service exporter. And there's a lot more room for liberalization in services that could open up jobs in these areas. You know, Atlanta, Georgia economy is changing as more rapidly than many other places in the U.S. And services are key, I think. And we'll see. It's interesting to watch how they will couple their labor, regional development policies with their trade policies moving forward.
All righty, last question, folks. We're going to move from Georgia, the provincial, to the truly global and move over to Africa. We have a question from David Thomas, who's an editor at African Business Magazine. Will the Biden administration reverse current policy and support the Nigerian-American candidate as Director General of the WTO? Executive order, presume that would be an easy one to do, right? And will Biden continue to pursue bilateral trade deals in Africa or attempt to work more closely with the African Continental Free Trade Area?
I mean, I can take a shot on the first two of those. Yeah, I do think the Biden administration will reverse course on the Director General fight. The U.S. is isolated on that, and I think by blocking her candidacy, the U.S. is just making more enemies in Geneva. And I think the likelihood of the U.S. preferred candidate, who's a very strong candidate herself from South Korea, but I think yes, the Biden administration will change on that. I think the Biden administration will probably try to finish off the negotiations with Kenya that are currently underway. I think it's going to be awkward to stop those. So that may be sort of one exception to their no new trade agreements. You could argue that that's a continued trade agreement. I don't expect to see significant new trade initiatives in Africa for a while, though. I think like everything else on the trade agenda, the Biden administration is going to move pretty slowly.
Okay.
I'd love to see them reach out to Dr. Ngozi, who is eminently qualified, as is Minister Wu from South Korea. But now that Dr. Ngozi has been selected by the rest of the pack, I think it's imminent upon us, and I think he will support her candidacy.